The 4 weeks since our last gathering seemed like a long time to me, and perhaps for some of you. This was because of the vague, unfinished business kind of feeling that I had after presenting Synchronicity Part 1 in December. Now, for those of you who weren't here last month, time constraints forced me to break up my overall story into 2 parts, and so waiting a whole month before I could complete the story seemed like a long time. I also found myself wondering if the incredible and overwhelming research material that seemed to keep appearing over the last month would allow me to make Synchronicity Part 2 an actual ending to the story. Finally reminded myself that this community is called The Question for a reason. And the reason is that together we fight our conditioning that such an incredible story requires a completion, or an ending, or even an answer. So I'll share Part 2 with you tonight, with the more realistic notion that I've not really written an ending, but maybe just the beginning of a beginning. However, because this whole presentation was at least intended to be a 2-parter, I need to kind of reset the stage for both new and returning community members by borrowing a familiar narrative device from television called the recap sequence. So, previously on Synchronicity. Last month I began the presentation with a couple of personal stories. The first story concerned 2 expectant mothers, one of them my wife, first meeting in a hospital as they experienced labor, then sharing unexpected risks and profound joy in the birthing process, and then being abruptly separated with no way of staying in touch with each other. 4 years later, as I was busy tidying up my garage, an unexpected tandem bicycle accident right on the street in front of my house drew me to the rescue of the rider and her young passenger. It was the very same young mother from the hospital and her now 4-year-old daughter. Now, our families have never lost touch again. The second personal story occurred in the spring of last year as I was driving on a secondary gravel road, trying to find a recording studio located on a rural acreage just outside Chestermere. I stopped for just a few seconds to glance at a Google Maps printout, just to get my bearings. About a minute later, as I was approaching an uncontrolled crossroads, partially obscured by trees and farm buildings, another vehicle suddenly rocketed across my path from the right, missing the front end of my vehicle by just a few feet. My life was altered, perhaps forever, by just a momentary glance at a Google map. I threw these personal stories out there to prompt all of you to think of your own personal stories and how you settled them and how you settled the outcome in your own way, in your own mind. Many of us safely settle the outcome by describing our stories, no matter how epic they are, as coincidence. Now, what is coincidence? Well, coincidence is a remarkable or unique concurrence of events without any apparent causal connection. The idea of coincidence is like our modern easy science default setting. It's what I described last month as the sociological equivalent of political correctness. Our natural reluctance to acknowledge or believe anything that isn't scientifically proven is pretty much the beating heart of coincidence. And like most politically correct behavior, this default setting keeps us safely uncommitted and unembarrassed. I then shared a really simple intellectual grid that illustrated where the question of coincidence might be positioned in our thought processes. The grid runs from completely crazy at one end to completely proven in the center to completely possible at the other end. Coincidences sit somewhere in the zone between completely crazy and completely proven. This safe zone is a convenient catch-all for pretty much everything that we experience but can't explain. Now, we become so accustomed or conditioned to living in this kind of intellectual safety that we've been duped, in a way, into believing that if our personal stories of coincidence can't be empirically understood any other way, then a purely personal validation of their significance might label us with a crazy sticker. And naturally, we don't want that label. And yet, here's the first question of the evening. Can you not empirically validate curiosity just by saying that you're curious? Just like every explorer or scientist or disruptor that came before us, it's curiosity that provides the necessary courage to move out of the safe zone toward the completely possible end of the grid. And like every curious explorer that came before us, the further we move away from the completely proven, the less safe it will feel. I think Victor talked about that tonight. The new danger zone on the other side of completely proven is where the question of synchronicity hangs out. In Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, we see the remarkable result of his 4-year relationship with Albert Einstein, which suggested possible links between new physics and new psychology. We can also see that the 1925 Golden Scarab incident validated Jung's assertion about the possibility of synchronicity between the greater universe and our personal experience. But the theory of synchronicity was still missing a crucial component. By 1925, Jung had not yet identified this missing component, but he might have expressed the question this way. If Einstein's space-time is the medium of synchronicity, and the Golden Scarab is the outcome of synchronicity, then what is the mechanism of synchronicity? Now, Jung himself spoke about the answer to this question in a 1953 letter. Professor Einstein was my guest on several occasions at dinner. These were the very early days when Einstein was developing his first theory of relativity, and it was he who first started me thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space and their psychic conditionality. His genius as a thinker exerted a lasting influence on my own intellectual work. I pumped him about his relativity theory. I'm not gifted in mathematics, and I went 14 feet deep into the floor and felt quite small. More than 30 years later, the stimulus led to my relationship with the quantum physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, and to my thesis of psychic synchronicity. So, who was Wolfgang Pauli, and how did he join Freud and Einstein to become one of the godfathers of synchronicity? Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, could be considered the godfather of synchronicity because it was he who first understood the significance of the human unconscious as the driving force of our conscious thoughts and behavior. Freud, the godfather, was the powerful inspiration and mentor to Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology and the actual father of synchronicity. Now, without Freud's revolutionary model of the interaction between the conscious and the unconscious, represented here by his famous psychic iceberg metaphor, Carl Jung would never have received the foundation for his own theory of a critical third component to the human psyche, the collective unconscious. This new psychic iceberg of Carl Jung included the encompassing ocean of the collective unconscious, an interactive companion to our personal unconscious. Jung theorized that this ocean of consciousness was mysteriously shared by all of mankind throughout all of history. It was the collective unconscious that would be the perpetual swinging door of the bakery that makes the chocolate cake of synchronicity. So, why did Carl Jung take us out of the safe harbor of being completely in our own heads and cast us adrift into the cold, uncharted ocean? Well, in the years leading up to his theory of the collective unconscious, two deeply influential experiences shaped Jung's vision of the human psyche, the universe, and the possible link between them. The first experience was a remarkable 4-year relationship with Albert Einstein, where the two explorers would meet regularly over dinner to share and discuss their ideas. This period of time was formative for both of them, as it also took place right in the midst of Einstein's formulation of the theory of relativity. During these friendly, informal dinner conversations, Carl Jung was deeply inspired and began to see parallels between Einstein's view of space and time and his own views of a transcendent human consciousness. The second experience occurred shortly after Jung's dinner friendship with Einstein came to an end, and after his professional relationship with Freud collapsed under the strain of his new disruptive thinking. So, lapsing into a kind of bipolar depression, for over 3 years, Jung carried out his clinical work by day, but by night, and night after night, he experienced a continuing series of conscious and unconscious visions, which he called active imaginations. He recorded this 3-year confrontation with the unconscious, his words again, complete with detailed illustrations, in a powerful journal that he named the Red Book. This important private journal was only made public in 2009, okay, almost 100 years from his first entries. And it details the experiences that convinced Jung of the existence of another unconscious realm. It was a realm of mythic thoughts and images. This is another one of his illustrations, something he called the psychic life of our ancestors. The images were so powerful that Jung concluded that they could not have arisen solely from his own personal experiences or memories. Now, the coincidental synthesis of Freud's original model of the mind, remember the iceberg, Einstein's new perspectives on the relativity of space and time, and Jung's unprecedented Red Book journey provided the foundation for the theory of the collective unconscious and opened a pathway to the theory of synchronicity. I'm now going to take you further down that path in Synchronicity Part 2. Now, I should mention that Victor's description of his process for writing songs, just to allow words to come to him and spontaneously occur inside the song, this may be a possible explanation of where those words come from. I begin Part 2 with one of Carl Jung's favorite stories, which he often used to illustrate his ideas about synchronicity. The story is from Lewis Carroll's book, Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, and involves a short exchange between Alice and the White Queen. I laughed when I discovered this story, as over a month before I started researching Carl Jung, I myself was coincidentally inspired to use an Alice in Wonderland metaphor for my own journey as a presenter, tumbling down the rabbit hole of investigation and research. Here's the exchange. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. Now, jam refers to the condiment, okay, meant as a tasty reward to Alice for serving the White Queen. It must come sometimes to jam today, Alice objected. No, it can't, said the Queen. It's jam every other day. Today isn't any other day, you know. I don't understand you, said Alice. It's dreadfully confusing. Well, that's the effect of living backwards, the Queen said kindly. It always makes one a little giddy at first. Living backwards, Alice repeated in great astonishment. I've never heard of such a thing. Well, the Queen replied, but there's one great advantage in it, that one's memory works both ways. Well, I'm sure mine only works one way, Alice remarked. I can't remember things before they happen. Well, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards, the Queen remarked. Jung felt that this story illustrated our conditioned response to the intersection of meaningful events. We want to reason those events retroactively from some known established cause or set of causes. This conditioned response is our version of the poor sort of memory that only works backwards. The White Queen's memory system, which advantageously works both ways, remained one of Jung's favorite metaphors for synchronicity. Now remember the jigsaw puzzle? We can remember forward that the individual pieces make a complete image without first knowing how they fit together. Jung's favorite personal story of synchronicity occurred in 1925, about 9 months after he first introduced his theory of the collective unconscious. He was treating an intelligent, highly educated young woman whose very stubborn shell of logic and rationality presented a difficult barrier to a more open discussion of her darker inner struggles. This barrier was very frustrating to Jung and had become a significant handicap to the woman's treatment. A few days into the woman's therapy, Jung was listening to her account of a vivid dream from the night before in which someone had presented her with a piece of expensive jewelry, a golden scarab brooch. Now, I'll ask Jung to describe the rest of this synchronous event. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in an obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed very strange to me. I opened the window and immediately caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabid beetle, whose gold-green color almost nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. This was Jung's own version of remembering forward. Now, it's been 90 years since that incident, and now in 2016, puncturing a hole in our rationalism is even more difficult. But let's see if we can puncture a few holes in rationalism anyway. Ironically, by returning to Jung's relationship with rational, visionary scientists. In Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, we see the remarkable result of his 4-year relationship with Albert Einstein, which suggested possible links between new physics and new psychology. We can also see that the 1925 Golden Scarab incident validated Jung's assertion about the possibility of synchronicity between the greater universe and our personal experience. But the theory of synchronicity was still missing a crucial component. By 1925, Jung had not yet identified this missing component, but he might have expressed the question this way. If Einstein's space-time is the medium of synchronicity, and the Golden Scarab is the outcome of synchronicity, then what is the mechanism of synchronicity? Now, Jung himself spoke about the answer to this question in a 1953 letter. Professor Einstein was my guest on several occasions at dinner. These were the very early days when Einstein was developing his first theory of relativity, and it was he who first started me thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space and their psychic conditionality. His genius as a thinker exerted a lasting influence on my own intellectual work. I pumped him about his relativity theory. I'm not gifted in mathematics, and I went 14 feet deep into the floor and felt quite small. More than 30 years later, the stimulus led to my relationship with the quantum physicist, Wolfgang Pauli, and to my thesis of psychic synchronicity. So, who was Wolfgang Pauli, and how did he join Freud and Einstein to become one of the godfathers of synchronicity? Wolfgang Pauli was a Swiss theoretical physicist and is considered one of the original defining voices in the field of quantum physics. He's credited with some of the most important theories that still shape our modern understanding of quantum mechanics. Some of his more notable theories are the principle of spin in subatomic particles. I'm not going to explain these to you, but they're really, really fascinating and they're really important. The probable existence of neutrinos, and the principle of exclusion, or the Pauli principle. It's an essential key to the discovery of new quantum particles, like the Higgs boson, also known as the God particle, which was discovered in 2013. Pauli's accumulated contributions to science were considered so significant that Albert Einstein personally nominated Pauli for the Nobel Prize in 1945, which he was awarded that year. Pauli's quantum principles have helped validate Einstein's relativity model of space, time, and gravity. For example, much of our current understanding of the structure and behavior of black holes and wormholes is driven by a basic synthesis of Einstein's and Pauli's theories. More to our point, the idea of synchronicity was also a synthesis of Carl Jung's theories of the unconscious and Wolfgang Pauli's theories of the quantum universe. This story of synthesis is really fascinating. In 1930, Pauli experienced a severe emotional breakdown following his mother's tragic suicide and a sudden, painful divorce. In desperation, he sought out Carl Jung and began a 4-year clinical exploration of the complex struggle with his emotional, scientific, and psychic identities. Through the course of this clinical relationship, Jung recorded and analyzed 1,300 of Pauli's dreams, many of which contained mythic images and themes that resonated with Jung's own experiences during his powerful Red Book period. Albert Einstein had inspired Carl Jung to see the possibilities of a harmony, if not a unity, between physics and psychology. Jung's relationship with Wolfgang Pauli soon evolved into a similar scientific exchange, but this time involving quantum physics. Through the analysis of Pauli's dream experiences, parallels emerged between Jung's theories of universal archetypes operating in the collective unconscious and Pauli's theories of subatomic particles operating in the quantum realm. Pauli could not reject Jung's theories about these unseen, unverified psychological phenomena any more than he could abandon his own theories about the unseen, unverified phenomena of quantum physics. Pauli was convinced that quantum mechanics provided the most plausible scientific explanation for Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. In turn, the collective unconscious provided the most plausible psychological explanation for Pauli's powerful dream experiences. The collective unconscious also provided a rationale for Pauli's unorthodox view of the origins of scientific discovery. Pauli believed that many important scientific advancements were not always born of a logical process or empirical evidence, but instead were often subjective, intuitive, inspired, and visionary, and way ahead of the evidence. And finally, through this remarkable parallel vision of psychology and physics, Carl Jung was convinced that Pauli's quantum theories of subatomic particles had finally provided his missing mechanism of synchronicity. It's appropriate to tell or retell the story of visionary science from our presentation that we gave last October. It's the story of the 19th century German scientist August Koekkoek, who transformed the entire field of organic chemistry by unlocking the mystery of molecular structure. Koekkoek had pondered the mystery of chemical structure for many years, and in 1865, he was concentrating on the unknown structure of the organic compound benzene. Eventually, he emerged from the concentrated research with a revolutionary structure of the benzene molecule. We call this the benzene ring. Now, this became the most important template for the whole science of chemical compounds, even to this very day. For 25 years, Koekkoek kept secret the scientific method which had enabled this historic discovery. But at a conference in 1890, he finally revealed the story behind the discovery. He said that after a particularly frustrating and exhausting day of research, his tired mind lapsed into a kind of half-awake daydream state. As he nodded off, he had a brief but very clear vision of a group of dancing atoms that gradually formed into the image of a serpent seizing its own tail. At that moment, he awoke with a new and correct vision of the linked circular structure of the benzene molecule. Now, this scientific manifestation of a visionary ancient form illustrates why Jung and Pauli became close colleagues for almost 30 years, exploring and co-theorizing a unified model of psychology and physics that they called unus mundus, or one world. By the way, the image on the left isn't a depiction of August Koekkoek's dancing atom snake. It's actually one of Carl Jung's illustrations from one of his own visions recorded in the Red Book. So if you followed me so far, Carl Jung's path from Sigmund Freud to Albert Einstein to Wolfgang Pauli is pretty much the story of how coincidence could become synchronicity by embracing rather than abandoning science. It's also a story about how creative visionary minds can give birth to theories of reality that have no possibility of being empirically proven until far into the future. And yet, the theories are nonetheless true at the moment they're born. Such visionary minds are capable of remembering forward. I only have time this evening to share one more big story about synchronicity. If you've been respectfully the kind of person who privately rolls their eyes when someone says, well, you know, things happen for a reason. This big story may provoke you to stop rolling your eyes and perhaps to retask them to begin exploring the story. You'll remember that Carl Jung analyzed 1,300 of Wolfgang Pauli's dreams and visions. In 1934, Pauli described perhaps the most significant recurring dream that he had. It was the dream of a surreal object in motion that he called the world clock. Now, as you can see, the clock consists of 4 basic components: a horizontal dial upon which 4 sections are marked with human-like figures holding pendulums, a vertical dial sharing the same central axis The vertical dial has a large rotating pointer and is divided into 32 sections. A horizontal golden ring surrounding the entire apparatus, and then a large black bird physically supporting the apparatus. The horizontal dial, vertical pointer, and golden ring are all rotating at different speeds, calculated as derivatives of the base number 32, the number of segments on the vertical dial. Okay, now, Victor, I'm really glad you're here, because it's a calculus problem, which I've completely forgotten how to solve. Unfortunately for me, this mathematical signature of the clock was important to a physicist like Wolfgang Pauli, probably important to an engineer too. But mercifully for me and for you, it was the interactive motion signature of the clock that really connects him with Carl Jung, and thankfully allows me to continue my story without the calculus tutorial. The world clock is the most significant inspirational vision of Jung and Pauli's combined model of psychology and physics, the unus mundus, the one world. They were continually inspired to discuss and debate the components of the clock for almost 30 years. It was a complicated dialogue, no doubt, naturally fueled by their individual scientific and philosophical passions. But for our purposes, I want to share with you what amounts to their consensus view of the symbolism and the significance of the clock and its connection to the question of synchronicity. At least I'm going to do my best. The large black bird that supports the entire structure is likely symbolic of the known universe, or observable space-time, whatever, wherever, and whenever that is. The horizontal dial, with 4 human figures holding pendulums, represents our conscious existence in earthly time. This real-time existence is consistent with the quantum mechanics principle that local reality is subject to the status of the observer and the observed. In other words, our entire conscious existence is subject to our human measurement of and accounting of time. The vertical dial, that shares a common axis with the horizontal dial, represents the very separate but interrelated dimension of the collective unconscious. This is the unseen quantum dimension of ancient forms, images, and themes that regularly cycles and intersects with our conscious life. The pointer that emanates from its center moves through the 32 points on the dial at a rate synchronized to the rotation of the horizontal dial. Consequently, when the horizontal dial passes through the vertical dial at the 2 points of intersection, you can see them there, at that moment the position of the pointer dictates what's passed on to our conscious world. These 2 points of intersection are the perpetual doorways of synchronicity. Now, both Jung and Pauli recognized that the vertical dial was not controlled by man, but was encountered by man at meaningful synchronous moments in our conscious reality. Could be when you're writing a song, Victor. The horizontal golden ring rotates at the same derivative rate as the smaller horizontal dial, but it surrounds the entire clock at a distance and is not itself supported by the black bird. So to Jung and Pauli, the ring suggested a much larger quantum reality that transcends all of our psychic concepts of existence, conscious or unconscious, and physically extends beyond the parameters of the known universe. The golden ring was thought to represent the possible source of the collective unconscious and the underlying principles of the physical universe. It was perhaps the meaning behind the meaning of things. Now, Jung, the psychologist, was persuaded that the general action of the dials, their correlated spins, and the intersections were a dream vision of the link between the collective unconscious and our conscious world. It was like an elegant picture of synchronicity in action. Pauli, the quantum physicist, agreed with Jung on the issue of psychic synchronicity, but he also saw the clock as a greater image of the synchronous motion and mechanism of the physical universe. Pauli was especially struck by the precise interaction of the horizontal dial and vertical dial, both sharing the same central axis. As a physicist, he was also intrigued by the suggestion in the dream that there was a derivative mathematical relationship governing the movement of all the components. It was, after all, a clock. Jung and Pauli shared their parallel visions of psychology and physics for almost 30 years. During this time, they exchanged over 80 comprehensive letters, eventually published in an anthology called Atom and Archetype. a great title. These letters articulated the evolving compatibilities between their studies, even though their respective backgrounds prevented them from agreeing on absolutely everything. In 1952, they even co-published a book of essays called The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. Jung's essay was titled Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. Pauli's essay was titled The Influence of Archetypal Ideas on the Scientific Theories of Kepler. The combined book was an affirmation of their influence on each other. Jung's essay presented synchronicity as a phenomenon based in space-time physics. Pauli's essay presented Jung's psychic theory of archetypes as a functional aspect of cosmology. Now, to this day, their unified model of the psyche and the cosmos is a continuing object of controversy and wonder. It is simultaneously considered visionary, nonsensical, unifying, and divisive. But for the purposes of the question community, we might simply want to consider the model perplexing. It's perplexing because as individual theorists and scientists, both Jung and Pauli have established themselves as true foundational figures in their respective fields. It's perplexing because our modern understanding and application of clinical psychology and quantum physics is largely based on their now tested and proven individual concepts. It's also perplexing because most of us are not psychologists or physicists or engineers. But life events continually remind us that we are participants in their unified model, if there is a model at all. Doesn't that make you want to know? Whether you're a coincidencer or a synchronitician, you can probably tell I just made those up. I want to leave you with just a little bit more perplexed tonight. Now, if you recall the definition of synchronicity that I showed earlier, here's my own example of some concurrent events that may or may not be connected by meaning. A possible case of synchronicity. Concurrent event number 1. Some of you may remember from the October presentation where we first introduced the idea of the cognitive neural-based heart and the recently discovered electromagnetic field that emanates from the heart. This EM field extends upward and outward from the body, sometimes to a radius of 30 feet. The basic structure of this EM field is a geometric form called a torus, and it has a very unique motion signature, which I'll share with you in a moment. Concurrent event number 2. In that same presentation about the neural-based heart, I also shared a complementary scientific theory from another eminent theoretical physicist, Dr. David Bohm. Now, Dr. Bohm questioned how simple electromagnetic activity in our brain and other neural fields transforms into complex human consciousness. He theorized that limited electromagnetic neural activity must have an unseen quantum dimension that enables our virtually unlimited cerebral capacities. In essence, he proposed the existence of a quantum dimension of consciousness. Does that sound familiar? The neural EM field emanating from the heart becomes even more intriguing when thought of as a detectable external medium for quantum-based consciousness. Let's have another look at it. Concurrent event number 3. Now, while I was studying Albert Einstein's influence on Carl Jung, it was fascinating to gain a better understanding of what we call space-time. Now, it's a relativity-inspired term to describe the interaction of space, time, and gravity. This is a simple model or simple picture of Einstein's space-time model. It depicts the effect of a central gravitational force on the movement of objects around the source. It also illustrates the influence of the gravitational source on the shape of the surrounding space as you move closer to it. For example, we know that light itself actually changes shape under the influence of gravity. The simple mechanics of this model are similar to a heavy ball resting in the middle of a rubber sheet, with a smaller ball rolling around the outer edge of the sheet. As long as the smaller ball maintains a certain critical distance from the center, it can remain in a stable, consistent orbit. However, if for some reason the smaller ball loses horizontal momentum, vertical momentum takes over. and it will be pulled downward toward the axis, eventually colliding with the heavier ball. What struck me about the space-time model is the motion signature of horizontal and vertical forces interacting around a shared focal point or central axis. Einstein's space-time model is the basic foundation of modern astrophysics, but it is the quantum physics of Wolfgang Pauli and others that have provided the detailed understanding of energy and matter, which has led us to the next transformation of the space-time model. This is concurrent event number 4. Now, these are simple images of the new quantum physics model of space-time. The first image is of what we call a black hole. Next to it is the connected image of what we call a wormhole, or an inversion of two black holes. Now, the visionary work of quantum physicists like Wolfgang Pauli has given modern astrophysicists a new theoretical template to explain how black holes and wormholes might actually operate. So far, over 100 years after Einstein's first theory of relativity, advances in technology have enabled us to investigate and verify some of this new theoretical template. Key aspect of the black hole model continues to be the unique interaction of the horizontal and vertical forces around a central axis or focal point. The theoretical outcome of this interaction of forces is the possibility that black holes are actually the entry and exit points of wormholes to another part of the universe. Now, we are fascinated by the idea of these entry and exit points to another dimension. They represent possible intake and outflow points for some kind of cosmic exchange system. This model is no doubt science today, but remember, it began as a vision decades before it became science. So here's the possible synchronicity of these concurrent events that I hope will perplex you as it has perplexed me. It's the first time I've done this, so I hope it works. This video clip is a simulation of a torus energy field, similar to the EM torus that emanates from our heart. Now you can see the continuous interaction of horizontal rotation and vertical force operating around a shared axis. Does everyone see that? I'll just play it one more time for you. Again, notice the horizontal rotation and the vertical force as well, operating simultaneously around the central axis. Where the pointer is where the heart is. This next video clip is of an actual black hole observed by NASA's SWIFT satellite in September 2012. Now you'll notice a similar rotation, horizontal rotation and vertical gravitational force operating around a shared axis. Pretty interesting, eh? Keep in mind, it is an animation, but it's actually from data observed by the SWIFT satellite. You want to see it again? Yeah. It's hard to kind of see where the black hole starts, but there it is, hole in space. Horizontal spin, vertical force. Now, this is a vision of Wolfgang Pauli's world clock. Now, do you remember the unique motion of the clock? The interaction of the horizontal dial with the vertical dial connected by a shared axis and allowing for two separate intersection points? Carl Jung believed that Pauli's clock helped explain how the collective unconscious and synchronicity operates in the psychic universe. Wolfgang Pauli further believed that the clock revealed the mechanism of an expansive, unknown physical universe. So, what do you think? Are you struck as I am by the remarkable similarities of form and motion between Pauli's original vision of the world clock, our own heart EM field, and celestial black holes and wormholes? Expressed another way, Is it possible that our heart EM fields, black holes, and wormholes are all science-based working models of Pauli's world clock vision? Here's some other questions. Is the heart EM field a possible medium for synchronicity with the collective unconscious? Remember the snake and the benzene molecule? Now, if we consider David Bohm's theory that human consciousness is a quantum reality, like so many electrons or neutrinos, is it possible that our heart EM field is like a black hole or a wormhole for consciousness? Okay. If we consider David Bohm's theory that human consciousness is a quantum reality, okay, that it's not just simple electromagnetic energy, and the quantum reality is just like so many electrons and neutrinos, is it possible that our heart EM field, which is up in the upper right-hand corner, is it possible that that field is like a black hole or a wormhole for consciousness? Is it two mysteries or just a single mystery to think about what lies beyond a heart-based EM wormhole or a space-based celestial wormhole? Is it two questions or just one? Is it just one? According to Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, either wormhole is a gateway for synchronicity.